I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Europe. The proximate cause of the discussion is, of course, that Britain is scheduled to leave the European Union on the 29th of March, but it's not entirely certain that we will be. Not that we will be on the 29th of March, or perhaps at all. There is a state of meltdown in the British political system. As someone who sat in the British Parliament for almost 30 years, I've never seen anything like it. It may be that the government is in a state of collapse. It may be that not only the Conservative Party, but perhaps also the Labour Party are going to split, organically split into separate parties. A historic shift. The tectonic plates of British politics feel as if they are moving. And the reason is a 45-year division in the country as to whether Britain should be in the European Union or its predecessor, the Common Market, the European Economic Community. It's never really been settled. It's never gone away. Full disclosure, I was a campaigner for Brexit, for Britain leaving the European Union, and I haven't changed my mind. But that will not be the cause of any bias in my chairing of this debate this evening. We have our usual audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs too. And we're looking not just at Britain leaving the European Union, what that means for Britain, but what it means for the European Union. There's never really very much discussion about that. Britain leaving the European Union is the equivalent of the 17 smallest countries in the European Union leaving. Imagine 17 countries departing the EU. That's how significant Britain's departure is. Britain has been a net contributor. That is to say, we pay in far more than we get out for 40 years. That's going to leave quite a hole in the EU's budget. It's the reason why the EU is demanding really rather a sizable amount of money from Britain as we describe it, divorce settlement. But what will the political impact of Britain leaving be on the European Union? And will other countries begin to think about following us out the door? Is it possible, and I'm one who believes that it is, that in 10 years' time, the European Union will not be anything like how it looks today? Not just because some countries might leave, but because rather than have them leave, it's possible the European Union could go back to what it was originally, and I believe preferably a trading bloc, rather than a putative state, a kind of federal state without the democracy, with a government and even an army. All of these are very big issues. Now, of all the distinguished guests present, our first is the most. He sat with me in Parliament for many years. He was a member of the government as a Home Office Minister. He stood twice for the Conservative Party to be Mayor of London, the best Mayor of London we never had. Honourable Steve Norris, welcome to the show. Would you survey the scene for us? Is Britain going to leave? And if it leaves, what will be the impact on the European Union?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth just underlining the way that you presented that introduction. I think it was fair. I probably would say that, partly because I take the same view that you do. But there was one thing you said which I wouldn't agree with. You suggested that this rift in the UK with Europe has lasted for the whole 45 years. Of course, you also made the point that what we joined originally joined by Ted Heath, of course, and then endorsed by the British public during the Wilson government in 1975.
I'm old enough to have fought in that referendum too.
You and me both, comrade. We were there. But the fact is that, and we probably voted the same way, which was to say, for goodness sake, yes, let's recognise that after the Second World War, having trading partners like New Zealand and Australia and Canada, where actually we had bigger markets on our doorstep, made good sense. It might have been painful for some of our older brethren at that time, but the future was in a trading bloc with Europe, the European Economic Community, the EEC. And that, of course, was where the first mistake was probably made, because the irony is that the great père fondateur, the great men who born generally in the last decade of the 19th century, who saw the First War, fought in the Second War, and said this can never happen again, used this EEC as the mechanism to tie European countries together, but which then morphed over decades from the EEC to the EC. Suddenly this was just the European community. And then, without any involvement of any of the democracies of the member states, it became the EU. I remember on one occasion sitting next to the French ambassador at a dinner at Admiralty House, which is one of the great government buildings, as you know. And I said to him that my view was that this great transition from a pure trading bloc to something with many more implications than I had ever signed up to was the reason why we in this country were so skeptical. And he said, but Minister, you cannot seriously believe that the great père fondateur ever saw this as just something as almost irrelevant as a trading bloc. This was always a great political project. And that's where the great divide in Britain arises. You know, we had a referendum, thank you, Mr. Cameron. I won't be personally buying a copy of his memoirs if and when they ever reach a publisher. But that very, very narrow majority for leaving the European Union was a reflection for a lot of people of the sense that it simply was no longer representing their interests, that it belonged to a few, if you like, within the beltway of Parliament in London, that it had failed to represent the interests of the country. There were those on the other side of the argument who believed that we were turning our back on Europe. And for me, that's one of the saddest aspects of this whole debate, because nobody in their right mind is turning their back on Europe. We're turning our back on an organization which is unelected, which takes power away from member states, which is frankly incompetent in many, many ways. And if you look at the fact that its accounts have not been audited for something like 17 years. I was going to say,
it's a very expensive outfit.
It's a very, very expensive outfit indeed. And that growing sense of real unhappiness with the way that the EEC has now become this extraordinary body called the EU is what led to the referendum, the unhappiness in my party in particular, in the Conservative Party, but just as much in the Labour Party, where there are deep divisions. There always were, and they remain to this day. So what's going to happen? Well, first of all, I don't know any parliamentarian that is comfortable with the idea of simply ignoring the result of the referendum. It may be a great tragedy that Cameron, in his arrogance, didn't actually insist on a threshold of vote, such as happened in the 1979 Scottish referendum. This is a history lesson for some of our viewers. But in 1979, of course, a man called Jim Cunningham, Labour MP, ironically for Islington, but a Scot, said it would be ridiculous if something like in the independence of Scotland was decided by a single vote. And so he said we should have a threshold, 40%, only 40% of eligible electors should be required as a minimum for in that case, Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. Actually, the vote on the day was quite extraordinary in reflecting on current times. It was 52% leave, 48% remain. Somewhat familiar. Yep. And yet, of course, 52% of 70% wasn't enough to trigger that 40% threshold. And so the motion died. If Cameron had perhaps had, if you like, the humility to recognise that this issue was bigger than his ability to sell it to a lot of people in the north of England for whom he was anathema, then we might not be having the debate we're having. I would regret that in many ways. But we had the debate, we had the vote, 1 million more people said they wanted to leave than wanted to remain, and so we will leave. The issue for me is that actually Mrs. May, dogged, determined, honest, resourceful, many good things, is simply a hopeless negotiator and, frankly, a dreadful leader. And the vote against her is far more significant than the vote for her in the snap leadership ballot the other day. Just demonstrates that at least a third of her party, even being told, look, don't rock the boat, are saying...
And even being told, I have no plans to lead you into the next general election.
Even given that, which normally is the kiss of death for any politician, those people are saying she simply isn't up to it. There are two big issues that stand between Britain leaving on perfectly sensible terms and not doing so. And many of the Conservatives who have withheld their support would name these two issues. One is the Irish border, and the other is the so-called backstop arrangement. The wonderful Attorney General, who we now have, a man born, in my view, to be the author of one of those songbooks with a wonderful basso profundo, a man with an amazing voice. We've seen nothing like it in generations. George, you were pretty good, but boy, this guy is in a class of his own. He made it absolutely clear in his statement to the House of Commons that the EU will determine when Britain is allowed to leave the provisions for a new customs union, and only when they say so, because they can say absolutely whether the backstop provisions work or don't. Many of us find that completely unacceptable.
It's a kind of vassalage.
Because it's a wonderful word used by our extraordinary colleague Jacob Rees-Mogg. I admire Jacob in many ways, but not least for his wonderfully creative use of language. But you see, not just that. What really depressed me, was that if you rely for your parliamentary majority on 10 Democratic Unionist Party politicians, and that's simply a fact of life, wouldn't they be top of your list when you went to Brussels to say anything to do with the Irish border is simply off the table? You will never threaten the territorial integrity of Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and yet she seems to have forgotten that somewhere along the line. And the backstop, how could you get yourself into that kind of position? Will Quince, one of the, I think, rather sensible, responsible members of my party who resigned from his job on the payroll, said in his letter to the Prime Minister, I'd love to go with you, but I can't because you leave these great loose ends hanging around, and without them being tied properly, I simply can't be with you. And so, she is left, having gone back to Brussels and having been told very predictably, I'm sorry, the shop's closed, with no deal, with no possibility of allowing a vote, because if a vote on the current deal was allowed, she'd lose by probably 100, maybe more. And that's a very unstable situation. However, this is how the European Union works. In the end, are these two issues enough to try to force the UK into what could be an alternative future outside the EU completely, working on WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules, immediately able to lower the cost of food for every household in the country by probably something in the order of 10-12%, because we currently charge very high tariffs on food that doesn't come from the European Union itself. It's not a bad outcome. And as we ease towards it, as more and more people are persuaded it could be the way through, then, Europe is going to have to think very, very carefully. The EU is going to have to think very carefully about the money. The money, you mentioned the money, it's about £40 billion. About 5 billion of that we're bound to pay. We as a country, just like every one of us in this audience, sometimes incurs legal obligations that you ought to satisfy. Could we walk away? I'm sure you could. Nobody's going to invade us. But we're not going to do that because our reputation as a country with some integrity requires us to make those payments. The other 35 million, we can simply walk away with. And that is, as you mentioned in your introduction, going to leave a huge hole in the EU's budget.
Let's turn to that, if we may. I'm deeply grateful for that wonderful tour de horizon. What will it mean? Think ahead. We've left, especially if we've left, as looks more likely now than any other scenario, without any deal at all, and into an entirely different orbit. What's the impact then on the EU of that?
I think very serious indeed. One of the impacts that people often mention is that when the UK leaves, it will lead a lot of other countries to leave as well. That may sound obvious. Actually, it's simply not true. And the reason is because Germany and the UK are overwhelmingly the largest net contributors to the EU.
You're not going to leave if you're a net beneficiary.
Which, when you mentioned those 17 countries, every single one of them is. They're all net beneficiaries. So I think the irony is that the EU will continue for some years. It will splutter along. The Germans will probably in the end make up the deficit in the EU budget because they're so economically reliant on the euro and on continued existence of the EU, but it'll be a greatly weakened EU. And you know what's interesting and sometimes gets people in this country quite irritated is that we're not even the biggest single issue the EU is facing. They're facing the rise of the hard right in Eastern Europe and, of course, famously in Germany too with AfD. Mrs. Merkel has lost effectively all of her power. She may remain in office as Chancellor for the next couple of years, but her power has already leached away. In France, Macron is looking increasingly weakened.
Well, as we speak, the streets of Paris are again on fire.
Indeed. And elsewhere in Europe, real unhappiness in Italy about
the Italian budget crisis.
Exactly. So, you know, you will know all of these issues very, very well indeed. I think the future for the EU without the UK is going to be very painful and is in many ways going to have left long behind those deep wishes and deep concerns of the great founding fathers of the European organization, who simply wanted to keep the continent from fighting itself into the ground as it did so appallingly for two
although
times
it's not
in
the Peace Corps,
century.
Steve, because although they haven't been fighting each other, they have been fighting other people. The countries of the European Union are scarcely never at war. They are at war now in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in most cases. France and Germany, of course, important exceptions. They had a war with Yugoslavia. France was the primary driver of the destruction of Libya and so on. So there has been a lot of war. They just haven't been at war with each other.
Yeah, exactly so. And we know that the war that the founding fathers wanted to avoid was a war between France and Germany. Because those were the two great powers
last point then, before the break, because we did ask the public about it. What about this European army? When we raised in the referendum campaign that they planned on their own army, we were called conspiracy theorists. But only in the last couple of months, both France and Germany have indicated that there will be a European army, and Macron, although I'm sure it's ready to be cancelled now, has reintroduced conscription into the army in France. Say something, if you will, about the European army.
I've always been deeply suspicious of its intellectual underpinning, and for that matter, its practicality. We do, of course, have a European Defence Force. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's NATO. And its principal funder, of course, has been the United States of America. Now, Mr. Trump, who could start a fight in a cemetery, managed to irritate all of his European counterparts by suggesting that it might be a good idea if they paid their share, seeing they're the ones that the US was protecting. This might have been typical of his bull of the gate, bull in a china shop.
He had a point, though, didn't he?
But he had a point. And what was interesting is that during the last presidential election, Hillary Clinton was obliged to agree with him She didn't do so on many occasions during that election, but she did on that, because successive United States presidents have been very irritated by the way that European countries generally have some great, we've got the Americans, they're paying for everything, we don't have to do it. Ironically, the UK has always kept up its proportion of contributions, 2% of GDP, that's all it's asked. US, incidentally, is spending 4% of GDP on its own defence, and much of that is, of course, in Europe and elsewhere. So just as a stop clock's right twice a day, just occasionally Mr. Trump hits on an issue where he has some legitimacy. And my own view is that we are much safer with the Americans on board, with an organization that can actually stand up to Russia. You know, one of the painful things that Trump pointed out was that Germany is now getting a huge amount of its energy from the very country that the European army is apparently going to be established to resist, namely Russia. I see no logic in that.
What an opener. This is Kalima Horra, and we'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, talking about Europe. We took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London earlier to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Will Europe be better off after Britain leaves the EU?
No, I don't think so.
I think at first will be worse.
Europe, I think worse.
Worse.
Europe will be worse.
Do you think Europe will be better or worse off after Britain leaves the EU?
I think it will be worse, actually, because this will set an example maybe for other countries, and they will think, oh, well, we can be out of all this union.
I personally think Europe and Britain is going to be, like, both countries are going to be worse off.
It's hard to say. I mean, it's got so many factors that's associated with it, so it's a wait and see, I think. You just have to see where it turns and what the consequences will be.
Do you think other countries might leave the EU after Britain?
Well, it is quite possible that this is going to be part of something bigger, and I very much doubt Britain is going to set a good example here. But, you know, you've seen the mood in the US and all over the world. I mean, the world is going anti-globalization, so it's quite possible that there's going to be other populist politicians in the world who, in Europe in particular, who are going to push others towards, well, their exit of European Union.
I think there is a possibility, but I wouldn't say a probability.
I think so, yeah.
Once one leaves, I think the others, tend to follow suit, whether they all leave or not, but there's certainly going to be one or two that will follow suit.
And do you think more countries will follow Britain out of the EU?
Unfortunately, I think this is a trend. I mean, also in Italy, they are talking about not really going out of Europe, but they're very critical towards Europe.
I think some parties will try to do that, but I'm not sure. I don't think they will probably follow up until they realize if something is going to be good or bad. I think they're afraid yet to do that, but some countries, I'm from Spain originally, and some countries, some parties have that kind of thoughts already.
Oh,
no,
not necessarily.
There is
Possibly.
a potential for this, but after they've seen the difficulty of the present situation, they might think again.
Well, there weren't many British people actually in that vox pop. Most of them were foreigners, but nonetheless, very wise words. Dr. Russell Foster from King's College London, you're a professor of European studies. Let's pick up on some of those points. And the ones Mr. Norris adumbrated earlier. Most of the countries of the EU are net beneficiaries of the union. Britain is one of the very few who are net contributors. Britain is leaving. Germany is moving into some quite turbulent political waters. Might not any longer be possible for German governments to pick up the tab for so many countries. That's inherently a dynamic that can only lead to further problems for the EU. Say, if you will, the EU after British departure as you see it.
Well, I feel it behooves me to defend the EU at this point. I did campaign for Remain. I still am a Remainer. I think that staying in the EU is the least painful of some very bad options. But one thing that really stands out is that since the referendum result was announced, we've seen British politics becoming what we call sacralised, where what's left of Remain, the remains of Remain, are treating the EU as some sort of a utopia, some sort of a promised land. They forget that, as Steve pointed out and as some of the guests on the Vox Pop showed, the EU has got very, very significant problems. One reason that the Brexit negotiations have been unsatisfactory over the last 2.5 years is not just because the British are poor at negotiating. I would disagree with Steve. I think that Theresa May is a decent negotiator, but she's trying to negotiate the impossible. But another reason for their unsatisfactory outcome is that the British are not a priority for the European Union. They've got much, much bigger fires to fight back at home. Now, this speaks to what is for me the biggest problem of the European Union. Back when it was the EEC and the EC, it was undemocratic, it was run by technical elites, but it had to be in order to function. We, the public, don't understand industrial quotas, finance exchange rates, these sort of things. It had to be run by experts. But then in the early 1990s, in the heady, exciting days when the wall had come down and the Soviets had been cast into the dustbin of history, the European leaders saw this as their moment to push forward with the political mission which had been there since the late 1940s. The consequence is that now Europe is halfway between an economic trading bloc and a state, a United States of Europe. It's got some of the functions, but not all of them. It's got some of the legitimacy, but it's lacking that. And one consequence of this is that just over half of the British population voted to leave. Now, we've discussed there whether there is a possibility of other European nations following the British out of the door. The short answer is no, not yet. Currently, the Europeans are looking at the British, basically sitting back with popcorn, watching as our country collapses in on itself like a dying star. In the summer of 2016, there was a great concern or a great excitement, depending on your point of view, that Britain would start a domino effect and that other countries would follow us. Other countries are looking at how disastrous our situation is and thinking...
How is it disastrous? Do tell.
Well, it's disastrous because we've got the possibility of our own country breaking apart. We saw this in the call for a second Scottish referendum, and the possibility...
To be fair, that's existed for 100 years.
It has been, but it's accelerated a great deal. We even saw the ludicrous suggestion in 2016 that London should declare itself independent and apply to join the EU. We've got two parties which, as you pointed out, are on the brink of splitting, and we've got British society has gone from being split into two factions of Leave versus Remain into three factions of the hard Brexiteers, the soft Brexiteers and the Remainers. And these three factions are not treating each other in a polite and civil political way, but essentially excommunicating each other as heretics. So other countries are watching this, aware that if they were to hold a referendum without a threshold, without a supermajority, they could see the same thing happening, and they could see themselves offered a rather rough deal by the EU. Do as we say, or you're out of the door with a hard Brexit, with a hard leave and an unknown future. Now, the EU does have much more significant problems. In one way, Brexit is actually good for the EU. The British have always been a reluctant member of the European Union. We've never really felt European. Culturally, geographically, ethnically, we're European. But as a consequence of the Napoleonic Wars and 2 world wars, Britain has felt politically isolated. And so they've never really been a part of the European family. So with the British on the way out, this means that the European Union can push ahead with plans for further integration. We saw this in the PESCO Defence Treaty signed last year. For the last 60 years, the British have been the ones putting a brake on European military integration. Now that we're going, it can accelerate quite quickly. Whether or not it will actually result in anything meaningful is a different matter. Also, with the British MEPs out of the European Parliament, we're looking at 56 MEPs leaving. This will create this will give greater strength to pro-EU bodies and pro-EU factions in the European Parliament, who have got elections coming up in May in order to choose a new commission to replace Jean-Claude Juncker. So in a way it's useful. In a way it's going to be as much of a disaster for Europe as it is for the British. I suspect that a hard Brexit will be catastrophic for Britain. But nobody has a crystal ball, nobody can peer into the future, so we're basing it purely on speculation. If a hard Brexit is a disaster for Britain, it will be an equal disaster for Europe, because our net contribution into the European Union coffers disappears. All of those producers and manufacturers in Holland, in Germany and Italy lose a huge market. This isn't Luxembourg leaving. This is a country of 70 million industrial citizens leaving and taking their spending money with them. So if a hard Brexit is bad for Britain, it's going to be really bad for the European Union. Now, this brings up this issue that's been mentioned of a wave of Euroscepticism and anti-globalisation that is sweeping Europe. Macron has been proven to be plus ça change. He's the president of the rich. The French people don't like him. So he was seen as the embodiment of seen as Europe's messiah, Europe's saviour.
If the EU had a name, it would be Emmanuel Macron, wouldn't it?
It would. And he has portrayed himself as the saviour of a liberal Europe. It's clear that it's not working. Europe is heading towards greater Euroscepticism. The Germans are the ones to keep an eye on because they've got an election coming up in the near future to replace Merkel. Whoever replaces Merkel is going to be faced with a German population which is somewhat reluctant to give more money to other EU countries. We'll be facing a rise not only in the AfD but in Die Linke and the Greens in Germany as well, so threats to the establishment. And of course, they'll be facing a European Union which has lost Britain's contribution. If we think back to 2012, at the height of the Grexit potential, that Greece could withdraw, the Germans were able to bail out the Greek economy because the Greek economy is frankly very, very small. And the Germans could afford, in financial and political terms, to bail them out. When the next financial crisis happens, because it will. That's the very nature of capitalism. If the Italians have a crash, if the Spanish or the Irish or the Greeks yet again have a crash, Germany lacks the political will to bail them out, and there's no way that they can afford to bail out a big country like Spain or Italy, especially with British money having disappeared. So the future for the European Union does not look good. But I've just finished putting together a special edition of an academic journal on the future of Europe. Two things came out of this. Number one is that European Union studies and scholars of the EU have been blind to the possibility of it breaking apart. In the 1980s, there was a whole discipline which no longer exists called Sovietology, of studying the USSR. And the Sovietologists utterly failed.
I still study it myself, but go on.
As a historian, but not a political scientist. So the Sovietologists in the late 80s utterly failed to see the collapse of the Soviet Union, which happened very quickly and no one anticipated it coming.
Good point.
There's a similar thing going on with European Union studies. Since the 1950s, we have been obsessively focused on integration, on Europeanness. No one has talked about possible disintegration and scenarios of Europe's decline. The second point that came out of this edition is that the European Union staggers like a drunk from one disaster to the next. The Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, as far back as 2005, when the French and the Dutch rejected the proposed European Constitution. It lurches from one crisis to the next. Maybe crisis is the default setting for the European Union.
We didn't even... You've mentioned a word there that actually I didn't mention, Mr. Norris didn't mention, the migration crisis. How much of an impact has that had on deteriorating popularity of the EU as an institution?
It's had an enormous impact. One of the EU's biggest problems, and it's not the fault of the EU, is that the EU is treated as a scapegoat for when people are tired of their national governments. If something goes right, then the national government, wherever it is, will take credit for it. If it goes wrong, they'll blame it on the EU. And we saw this in the Brexit referendum, which was not really a vote against the EU. It was 17 million people voting against how much they disliked a London-centric government as much as they disliked the EU. The migration crisis was not the fault of the EU. It was caused by economic and social factors that go back decades. It was accelerated by the Arab Spring and by the NATO campaigns. The EU reacted to it, but was not a cause of it. But with the migration crisis, we saw a number of problems emerge. First is the European Union splitting into three. We've got northwestern Europe, the rich industrial countries whose populations complain that their hard-earned taxes are being bled away to Mediterranean countries. We've got Mediterranean Europe, who have been on the front lines of migration, who have been hit very hard by EU austerity, and who complain, we have to deal with this and you're not giving us any help. And then over in the East, in the post-Soviet, post-socialist countries, the ones who take no migrants, they complain about the EU becoming Islamified, that this is some sort of an ethnic displacement. The migration crisis has created something that the European Union's founders wanted. As far back as the late 1940s, when we had people like Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi talking about how a European identity needed to form. The quest for a European identity is something that has underpinned European integration since the 1940s. That European identity is now forming, but it's a very, very sinister and dark imagination. It's a European identity in which Europeans are white, Christian and resident, and the ones who are coming in are unwelcome. So the migration crisis's biggest impact is that it's forming a European identity which is antithetical to the EU itself.
High-class television, this. Kalima Horra. Be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, talking about Europe, Britain leaving, and what kind of hole Britain leaving will leave, and how the European Union will develop in the coming years. We took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London. Let's hear what the people thought.
Why do you think the EU might want to form a European army?
I don't really want to form a European army because I don't think the aim of Europe is a military one, but I think it's much more cultural and economical.
I suppose it's always the security that brings, is to bring an independent army, but I suppose it also brings everyone together. Everyone's then got a vested interest in the one army, and therefore decisions are made with a little bit more coercion.
Why? I don't know exactly.
If I'm honest, I haven't thought about that. There's a lot more other issues we have to think of, like in terms of Brexit, and if I'm honest, like I haven't thought about the army at all.
I think if we are all together, we won't need an army.
Well, if you could explain who the European army would fight, yes, I would agree with it. But as I can't see whom a European army would fight, I can't see very much point.
Will the US benefit from further breakups inside the EU, do you think?
I think they may. If Trump is the president there, still, hopefully not, but if still the president, he will be happy to have some more allies and people being not happy with the European Union and maybe thinking being friends with them, like armies and stuff like that. I think he's going to be benefiting from that, yeah.
I don't really know, but probably yes, due to their president. I mean, it's like a populist line, and therefore trying to make Euro split up. And I think that a single country is a weaker subject than a whole confederation.
The US? Oh. Yeah, they're gonna benefit. But yeah.
So it's hard to say. I'm sure at some point they'll work some advantage to themselves, but I don't know.
More countries are leaving, the euro will drop, and the US dollar became more powerful.
Yes, I think America is always benefit if Europe is divided.
Well, I don't know is the honest answer, but I think this is very much Donald Trump's agenda. And yeah, I'm not sure if people of America will benefit from this, but yeah, definitely Donald Trump. So.
How very interesting. Adam Gary, you're a historian of note. You have a program with me, actually, called The History Boys. You're Anglo-American. Do you agree with me that there's a bit of schizophrenia here in Britain? I mean, much though it's cool to say so, I don't actually feel all that European. I feel much more in common with the people of the United States than I do with Europe. Full confession. I watch American TV, I watch American movies, I listen to American music, I follow American boxing, and so on. I'd be lying if I said I sit down of an evening and watch Spanish movies or listen to French popular music. I don't. Is that schizophrenia in play with Britain leaving the EU and our relationship to the European mainland?
Well, it was Bernard Shaw who said that the English, the British, and the Americans were two people divided by the same language. He wasn't, though, speaking French or German at the time he said it. So the devil is in the details, but it's an increasingly small devil. There's two different approaches to this schizophrenia. One is an Atlanticist, very pro-American approach. One is an anti-American, but also Eurosceptic approach. I'll deal with the second one first. A man who sat on the opposite side of the House of Commons from you for many years, long gone, Enoch Powell, very controversial for other things. But one area that I think his wisdom, if you want to call it that, certainly his outspokenness needs to be paid attention to, is when he discussed how Britain and Russia bookend Europe. They are near Europe. The historical experiences are very much intertwined with Europe, but they're not necessarily of Europe at both a cultural level, a historical level, and in terms of the general political zeitgeist. Forgive me for using a German phrase to describe it. And so these people would say that Britain needs to look outward to the Orient, to Asia, to Africa, to the wider world, and that Britain shouldn't be boxed into we're European because it's a quick swim across the channel, nor should Britain be boxed into where this Anglo-American sphere because we have language, common law, and again, very, very much other cultural experiences shared between the United States, Britain, and the so-called white Commonwealth, as it used to be known, as opposed to the places within the former British Empire that became independent after 1945. Then there's the Atlanticist point of view, which says because same or similar legal system, both derived from common law, though Scotland is a bit different, but there's more Scots than English in America in terms of heritage, so that balances that out. And then the many other things that you pointed out. People will watch the same programs. And it is very interesting that it was only in the age of the Industrial Revolution, when America and Britain industrialized at similar times, but separately, that we get a lot of words that are different in British English versus American. This late 19th century, early 20th century period, when we have things like lift versus elevator, pavement versus sidewalk. Yet the world is coming together so much more in terms of both verbal and written communication that if one reads between the lines on both British television and in American media, one sees that Americans are adopting some British slogans. Forgive me for using a vulgarism, but 15, even 20 years ago, no American would know what shag means. Now they do, and not just because of Austin Powers. And likewise, all you need to do is go to the local UKIP meeting, those supporters of NATO, those admirers of Ronald Reagan, to find out how much they dislike the fact that Americanisms are creeping into the received pronunciation. And so Britain and America are weirdly becoming more culturally similar because of technology, which has helped a common language remain common. So in this sense, we're the equal and opposite of the end of the spectrum we were in terms of the George Bernard Shaw era. That makes a very strong cultural argument, but economically, I would say that Britain's best position as a post-imperial power would be to embrace economic and military non-alignment. And for this, Britain should look at why some of the reasons the EU failed are many of the reasons that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I believe is succeeding. The EU took a "we're going to ram it down your throat and integrate as quickly as possible" route, where ASEAN said no. So says one, so says all. Anyone in ASEAN can essentially veto any move forward. It's much more consent-based, and within that framework, gradualism is necessarily implied. Gradualism is necessarily the rule. When you look at the ASEAN Charter written in 2007, around the same time that Europe was debating the so-called EU Constitution, which then evolved into the Lisbon Treaty, and you read it, it's all about respect for sovereign nation states. It's all about a collective experience as opposed to forming a collective political system. And when you look at what's going on all throughout ASEAN, with the possible exception of Myanmar, you see optimism flowering, you see economies growing, you see living standards going up and up in spite of having to endure a horrible Japanese occupation in the 1940s and then an anti-colonial struggle against the main European powers, Western European powers, I should say, after the struggle with the Japanese. And so when you look at the origins of the EU and ASEAN, which were both aimed at preventing war, and ironically both aimed at preventing the spread of communism, they've both evolved into something different. ASEAN has become more collective in terms of responsibility and more respectful in terms of respecting nation states. The EU has gone in the opposite direction, and as a country whose foreign ministers used to once know a lot about the geography of Asia as a whole, and indeed of Southeast Asia, I think economically Britain would stand to gain a lot by having an Asian-first policy in terms of economic connectivity, while respecting the fact that Britain and America will always be connected because of the common language that's now spoken over the internet wires as much as anywhere else.
Fascinating. Let me test a hypothesis with you. I speak as someone who cares nothing about nations. I'm not a nationalist of any kind. That's why I oppose Scottish nationalism. I loathe British nationalism. But the EU, as George Bush might put it, misunderestimated the nation state, didn't it? The truth is, most people, not just in Britain, but in France, I'm sure it's true in many other European countries, think of themselves first and foremost not as Europeans, but as British or French. And the idea that they could be told, especially when they're net contributors, what to do by people that they didn't elect and could not remove, became more and more difficult to sell. Especially when it's quite clear that not everybody obeys the rules quite as much. Macron has just showered euros down the Champs-Élysées to try and dampen down the uprising going on in France. He's broken all the fiscal rules by doing so. France is now running a 3.5+% deficit, whilst Italy has just been caned for suggesting a 2.5% deficit in its budget, and has had to say, well, okay, we'll retreat and we'll only run a 2.04 budget. I'd suggest that Brussels looks closely at the accounts, actually, at the end of the year. Not sure the Italians will quite keep to that. But my point is, nationalism, the nation state, has by no means reached the end of its time historically. And to pretend otherwise was a mistake.
Well, very much so. One of the differences between most of Asia post-1945 and most of Europe post-1945 is that in Asia, nationalism tended to be a more progressive phenomenon because people were building nations whose identity was being recast after decades and in many cases centuries of foreign domination. In Europe, again, we have to go back to Kalergi, who even before the Second World War said, we need pan-Europa, we need to think of yourself as European. Clearly, he didn't read Nietzsche, who said that Beethoven was the last cosmopolitan composer. Since then, every composer in the European, and in this I include Russia and Britain, classical tradition has been very nationalist. Nietzsche was very much right. How ironic that it's Beethoven who provides the score for the national anthem of the European Union. In fact, so ironic is it that just the other day I saw a far-right English individual on television saying, we don't want to sing no Beethoven. I've never been in that particular situation.
Roll over Beethoven as the Beatles put
Indeed. An American song that was covered by the Beatles. So we have this sort of cultural synergy moving around this room at the very moment.
Mr. Norris went to school with Sir Paul McCartney, I should point out.
Ah, excellent. Well, I'm a huge Beatles fan, but lest we digress too far. Getting back to the European Union, what we're seeing in Europe is the biggest own goal of the century. And I know there might be some football supporters in this room, and I stand by that. An EU that was envisaged along these Kalergi very idealist lines, these Briand lines about let's get rid of nation states or at least minimize the effect that they have in people's consciousness. Now people are more nationalistic than ever because Europe is feeling a bit isolated now. They think that the walls are closing in terms of unresponsive governments whose democracies have become pseudo-democracies. They fear the migrant crisis for some irrational reasons and also for some rational reasons. It's not as dogmatic as black and white. And so you see nationalism fulminating, but at the same time you see Polish flags at a Brexit rally, an extreme Brexit rally, mind you, not the kind that a lot of people here support. And how ironic is that? That again goes back to this point of Europeanness as being the white man versus the non-white man, which is the kind of poison rhetoric about Europeanness we heard in Ian Smith's Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in apartheid South Africa, in the segregated south of the United States. So again, Europe is becoming like some of the places it once colonized in more ways than one. And frankly,
I was going to say, it's rather late in the day to want an all-white Europe, but it's not really, it's a pretty revolting thing to want.
Indeed.
But even if you do want it, it's kind of too late.
It is, and I see the only solution that I see is an economic one. When people are prosperous, they complain less, they cause less trouble, and they're more content. They're happy people. If you want a happy population, the objective way to do it isn't to censor the news, because people just not believe anything they hear, like they didn't in the last days of the USSR, or they rebel. And it's not to do this social engineering that's becoming more and more of a facet of one's liberal Europe. It's becoming quite authoritarian. If you let people have higher wages, if you look after them better, if you create more jobs, if you allow trade to work for, to borrow a phrase, the many, not the few, then these problems will all be vastly minimized. Never go away, but they will be minimized.
We'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Steve Norris, respond if you would in this, the last segment, to what you've heard on the screen and here in the audience.
Well, just to give time to the audience, I just wanted to make one point, which, as it happens, Adam touched on, and it's this issue around nationalism. And you know, you're touching it yourself. I agree that jingoism is really rather repellent. Nationalism is a natural instinct. Ironically, it doesn't mean complete homogeneity. I mean, I think what was interesting about the film, you remarked on it yourself, is that in a typical day in London, awful lot of people there aren't necessarily English or British, and I don't think any of us has any problem with that. That's, to me, one of the great joys of living in this country. But, you know, for myself, for example, what was quite important in the referendum was the notion that a nation that can't control, an area that can't control who comes in and who leaves is a local authority. It's not a nation. An area that has laws imposed
You're not a
upon
state
it.
if you don't have
You're not a state.
borders.
If you don't make the laws that you have to live by because they're made outside, then you're not a state at all. And I don't say that because I aspire to rigid statehood in exactly the way that Adam was talking about. But he also made, I thought, a really valuable point in relation to ASEAN, the organization of Southeast Asian states that replicates in many ways what the EU should be, when he made the point that they respect national integrity. And they do so by ensuring that effectively every vote has to be unanimous. For me, the greatest sadness has been the extent to which the United Kingdom, and for that matter, all the other countries of the European Union, are simply not able to govern themselves in their own interest. You know, I'm one who believes that it's really important to take back control of our borders. I'm equally, absolutely clear that to close them would be economic suicide. And when I look at what Mrs. May is saying, she constantly talks about ending free movement. That's not what closing borders, not taking back control of your borders is for me. What it is for me is simply having the right to do so if at some point in the future, Cave, Mrs. Merkel, at some point in the future, it might be necessary to impose some restrictions on access to the United Kingdom.
Well, yes, because labour is a factor of production, and if you have an excess of labour, it will have deleterious effects for the majority, not for the capitalists necessarily, just in the same way as other parts of the economy have to be balanced.
So we have, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have just under 4% unemployment. In modern terms, 4% unemployment means full employment. The 4% of the people you don't want to employ and they don't want to work for you. You know, the reality is that we need everybody we can get, from baristas to brain surgeons, frankly, right across the board. And if for some reason we're not going to get them from the European Union, where do we get them from? Well, ironically, from the other countries outside the EU, who the government could perfectly well have limited had they wanted to, and very sensibly didn't. So this talk of ending free movement is not the least of the reasons why I'm much less keen, frankly, on Theresa May's negotiating stance than perhaps has been suggested.
Dr. Russell, you mentioned this earlier. Please respond.
Yes, well, it comes back to the threats that are facing the European Union in the near future. At some point, Britain is going to leave. We'll probably get a slight extension, probably to hold another referendum. That seems to be where it's going. And my prediction is that when that happens, we'll get another razor-thin majority for one side or the other. The chaos will continue, but eventually we'll leave. We need to consider what is the future threat to the European Union. It's not unemployment. It's not a financial crash. It's not the Russians, who are nowhere near as powerful as the Kremlin would like us to think. What's going to test the European Union's sustainability and survivability is nationalism. In the aftermath of the two world wars, Europeans emerging from the ashes of Hitler's New Order realised that nationalism is not necessarily a good thing. And in the second half of the 20th century, there was a general consensus among academics, among policymakers, that the onward march of economic prosperity and greater communication and connectedness would lead to national identities just withering away and dying. The reverse has happened. In an acceleratingly globalized world, people cling to their national identities as a rock to cling to in the chaos of the new world. What Erich Fromm, the great German sociologist of the 1960s, described as the anxiety of meaninglessness, that if you don't have a national identity, you don't know who you are, and so people end up clinging to much more severe ones. There's one last thing to be said on the question of Europe and nationalism. Look at what was happening in Mayadeen Square in the Ukraine in 2014. Look at what was happening in Trafalgar Square in Britain with the people's marches on Parliament. The people who feel a strongest European identity are the ones who are outside of it. And a European nationalism is emerging. It's not necessarily a pleasant nationalism. We can look at how the Leavers and the Remainers in this country are just as poisonous in each other in denouncing one another. In 1963, David Mitrani predicted that increasing European integration would not lead to a transcendence of nationalism, it would just lead to an extension of nationalism. And for all of their claims that they represent cosmopolitanism and universal values, the people who paint their faces blue and march on Parliament are doing exactly the same thing as hardcore right-wing nationalists, saying that we belong, you don't, and this is where the boundary of our territory lies. If the European Union can survive that, then it may go on. But if the European Union harnesses that, it may become something not so pleasant.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting theory I hadn't thought of before. But I've got to tell you, these so-called people's marches in favour of the European Union are the most self-satisfied and prosperous marches I have ever seen. You can't hear them coming because they've all got very soft hush puppies on, and they've just been shopping for their quinoa in Waitrose before they turned up. If you went to Sunderland, where you're from, and hoisted a European Union flag, you'd be shot down pretty quickly. This was a revolt of the have-nots.
It was. I mean, last year I got an invitation to be part of a battle bus touring the cities of the northeast on behalf of what was left of Remain, to convince people that they'd been lied to on social media by Russian bots and that they didn't know what they were voting for. And I was invited to join this by the leader of It Who Shall Remain Nameless, who effectively said, "Oh, Russell, you're from here, you can talk to these people." And my response was, how many 65-year-olds in Middlesbrough and Carlisle do you think get their news from Instagram and Facebook? It was a vote against 40 years of being ignored by all parties in London. It wasn't necessarily a vote against the EU, it was a vote against the general status quo.
Against the status quo, yeah. Madam.
Hi, I'm Cheryl, what you might call an old amateur. I originally came from the Caribbean, Trinidad to be exact, and when I came to this country, I found it quite odd that we had sort of two parliaments, because most countries have one parliament. So that was my kind of bottom line. I voted to leave the EU because I didn't like what I was hearing. And unfortunately, when you put somebody like a Remainer, like Theresa May is, you know you're going to get sabotage, you're going to get dramas, and it has been dramas all the way since. We started off this nonsense, this thing with the Skripals being overdosed on fentanyl. Then it went down to you mustn't go to the World Cup because something horrible is going to eat you up in Russia. Then she went on this hate Russia tour, all distractions, all to stop doing her job. And so bombing help enabling the bombing of Yemen, people in Syria, still not focusing on Europe. Point is, Europe has turned out to be undemocratic. Nobody elects these people. We don't know half the time what Juncker is doing. He looks like he's drunk most of the time.
He likes a good lunch, yes.
Yeah. And she has turned out to be such a weak leader. Sneaky, sleazy, shambolic, warmongering. And I mean, the last thing I want to say is what Jeremy Corbyn has to say. Her government was found in contempt of Parliament, and she's a contemptuous person. Weak leader.
I got the impression that you didn't like her. As a matter of fact, most of those epithets are not true of her personally. She's not sleazy or any of these other things. She's a perfectly respectable person. But I think she's out of her depth, don't you, Steve?
Exactly. That's precisely the point I made. I mean, the reality is she's a, deeply serious, conscientious, dogged, Christian, daughter of a vicar and, impeccable personal credentials. She just happens to be a hopeless leader and an even worse negotiator. It is true that she perhaps is advised to practice some of the tricks of Parliament. A very clever one, incidentally, was to say, fine, you want to vote? We'll have it at 6 o'clock tonight before any of you can start manoeuvring, and maybe that's why she got 200 at least of her colleagues through the door in her favour. No, she's not a bad person. Just she's simply the wrong person to negotiate this really, really significant point in our national future.
There has been, Russell, no leadership developed in Europe for people who had a pan-European project. It is remarkable how small the leadership of that project has been. I can't think of anyone since perhaps Delors that was known by anybody else in any other country. And he's, 25 years gone. It is odd, isn't it, that all this money, all this power, and the best they can come up with is Junkers.
This is very true. I mean, as much as I do support the EU, I will be the first one to hold up my hand and say it has crippling problems, and it's very, very bad at dealing with those problems. As an example, just last month, a very famous newspaper, which I won't mention, submitted a freedom of information request to the European Parliament to see what the 700-odd European Parliament representatives are spending their expenses on. The UK MPs' expenses scandal was nothing compared to what's going on in Brussels. They get phenomenal amounts of money. Their response to this request, it's none of your business. So the EU already has this image of being heavily undemocratic, which it is. The EEC had to be in order to function. The EU is undemocratic, and it doesn't do anything to try and get away from this image. To go on to the point of Theresa May, I think that she's a decent person who was trying to manage the impossible. Nobody could negotiate a good deal with the European Union because they are stubborn, and they are protecting what they see as their interests. If Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister, if Jacob Rees-Mogg was Prime Minister, they would also get an unsatisfactory deal because no one can do any better. It points to a crisis of leadership. This is one reason that people like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, even Xi Jinping in China are so popular, because they can cleverly cultivate an image as the outsider fighting a corrupt system. And we're going to see more of that in the future, especially in Britain. Theresa May will step down. Who are the choices? Jeremy Corbyn, who can't even manage his own party and a roiling anti-Semitism crisis, or Boris Johnson, who has been shown to be all full of hot air. So we will see a populist strongman emerging in this country too.
Just to follow on from that, I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned in the wider Brexit debate so far, and hasn't been mentioned here, is what I call the C word, and that's charisma. The European Union doesn't have any charismatic leaders, and Theresa May, for all the virtues and vices that we've heard about her, she's not charismatic, and I don't even think her strongest supporter could argue that. In Britain, all of the charismatic voices were outside of Parliament in 2016, and generally for Brexit. We've had George here, who was one of the most articulate supporters of Brexit, Nigel Farage, the other from the opposite end of the political spectrum. And then even within Parliament, it's the people on the peripheries of the backbenches, like the Rees-Mogg, who might at times be confused for being a member of the 19th century Tory party rather than the 21st. But you can't argue that a man with such an aerobic tongue isn't charismatic. I do think that with people confused about this Brexit deal, not because they're stupid, as some of the London Remaining classes say, but because the press in Britain the standards have fallen so appallingly. If you had a charismatic leader selling Theresa May's god-awful deal that everyone hates, I think some of the members of the public might actually get behind it. But that's the problem when you're trying to sell a quagmire and you've got a quagmire-style personality. There's definitely a charisma deficit, and for some of the reasons we've heard earlier, people should not immediately dismiss that. In a democracy, charisma and communication is important.
Steve, there you go. A charisma-free Parliament, thee and me, may have to return. We await a grateful nation calling us back to the front line. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. This has been Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television.